Okay, now that you have understand what a crisis is and some of the characteristics that makes up a crisis, now we will look into how to prepare for a crisis for organizations and businesses. Okay, now number one is to assess the risk of your organization. How can you determine whether they are more or likely to experience a crisis? Now, it is safe to say that all companies are at risk of a crisis of some sort, okay, but publicly traded companies are at more risk, yeah, because of their nature of relationship with their key constituency, which is the shareholder, yeah, as compared to privately owned companies, which means that if a company is privately owned, there are still risks, but it may not be as bigger risk as a publicly listed company, because when you're publicly listed, your shareholder base is bigger. It means that people have stakes, yeah, in your organization. So if you were to go into a bankruptcy, it means that the entire shareholder base will go bankrupt as well. Okay, so what to do is that in times of crisis, you need to assess the risk of your organization. How do you do it? First, the person in charge of the corporate comm in your office must call for a brainstorming session. Yeah, so this brainstorming session, it will normally have to include the most senior managers in the organization, as well as representatives from every area possible that are most likely to be affected by a crisis. Okay, um, especially in big organization where you run operations, people from the operations field itself must be present in the brainstorming session, because they are closer to the on ground work that happens, so they may understand more of what kind of risk that they go through every day. They will be able to give you additional input. Okay, so during this brainstorming session, participants should work together, develop or trash out ideas about potential crisis. So in this brainstorming session, you list out all possible crises, or you must encourage participants so that they are very creative, yeah, in outlining what kind of possible crisis that may struck the organization. One should not be negative, yeah, about receiving ideas, because if a person actually thought about a certain thing, happening to an organization, that means that there is a possibility of it happening. It's just that we later need to prioritize what are the most likely to happen, and what is the most least likely to happen. All right, so and of course, yeah, people need to be encouraged to be as creative as possible during this stage, and to come up with the idea. So once an inventory of possible crises already exists, the facilitator of the brainstorming session, which is normally the corporate comm person, should help the group to determine which of the ideas developed have the most potential to actually occur. This means that you are already starting to prioritize your list. Okay, so once you begin prioritizing your list, okay, so it might be useful, for example, to ask the group to assign probabilities of the potential crisis, so that you can focus on the more likely scenarios, yeah, rather than wasting time working through solutions to problems that have very low probability of occurring. Yeah, again, this does not mean that you disregard the possibility. It's just that you want to work on the highly likely probability to happen first, rather than the least probabilities. Okay, so using this list that you have prioritized, yeah, you dah clean up and everything, you then determine the effect this specific crisis have on its constituency. Okay, so once you have the probability of risk has been assigned, yeah, to the potential crisis, organization needs to determine the constituency or the group of audience that would be mostly affected by the that would be most affected by that crisis. Okay, so you need to determine how to rank constituencies when a crisis actually happens. Yeah, this may be more difficult sometimes because there are so many other things that are going on, but for a specific crisis there must be one or at least two or three um, a group of constituency or audience that become more important than the rest, yeah, for that crisis. Okay, so but thinking about risk in terms of effect on constituency in advance will help the organization further refine which potential crisis it should spend most time and money preparing for, which means that if you know, for example, crisis A has the most potential to happen and will affect more group of constituency as compared to crisis B or C, then you can now convince the organization to spend more resources on dealing or in managing that crisis A instead of crisis B or C. Yeah, uh, contohnya kalau ada 5 million, 3 million for the first one and 1 million for the second or third one each respectively. Yeah, again, it doesn't mean that B and C dilupakan, but crisis A needs more attention because it has more effect on constituencies as compared to other type of crisis. Okay. Now, next is to begin setting objectives for your potential crisis. Okay. Now, setting communication objectives for potential crisis, this is different than figuring out how to deal with the crisis itself. Because of course at the end of the day organization must do both, but typically managers are more likely to focus on what kinds of things they will do during a crisis rather than what they will say and to whom. So the communication during crisis takes on more importance than action, because it involves more intangible things, yeah, such as loss of reputation rather than the loss of lives for organization. People would want to hear from you often in times of crisis. Okay, although you may not have many updates from time to time, but it will give them an ease of mind when they hear from you often. Yeah, rather than keeping them uh, stonewalling on them for a long period of time, yeah, without giving them updates. Okay. And then comes the third step, which is to analyze the channel of choice. Okay, one thing is about not only about what you communicate, but how you send it out. Okay, so participants in the planning session or the brainstorming session just now should begin to think what their communication objectives will be for each group of constituency. Okay, so you need to also determine whether this objective will be achieved. Yeah, and it often depends on the effectiveness of the communication channel. Okay, people may want to hear from you live, yeah, using tools now, live on Facebook or Instagram dan sebagainya, rather than waiting for you to issue a press release to be uploaded on your website or to be sent out to the media. Okay, so the channel of choice in times of crisis is very important, and especially now because you have so many types of channels that you can use to um, make your communication more effective and efficient. So your channel of choice must be very, very good and must accommodate, yeah, to different types of groups of people that you are facing. Yeah, so the choice of comm channel can often reflect how sensitive the company is, or and most sensitive way to communicate to consumers or their families, yeah, especially in times of crisis. And when there is devastation to lives, yeah, family would want to hear from you first and would want to hear from you as early as possible, as often as possible. Okay, so your channel of choice again determines the outcome. Sometimes there's nothing much you can do because you cannot control crisis, yeah, that are beyond your control, of course, but it is how you communicate with the people or the family members that will determine your position or your reputation later on. Okay. And okay, once you know the types of crises, you have prioritized them, you have determined who will be affected by a certain crisis, you have also understood different channel that you want to use to communicate the messages. You need to assign a different team to each crisis, okay? Now, another important part of planning for communication in crisis is to determine in advance who will be on what team for each crisis. Okay, um, different problems require different kind of expertise, yeah, and planners should consider who is the best suited to deal with the type of crisis versus another. Okay, for example, if the crisis is more likely to be a financial focus, then the chief financial officer may be the best person to lead the team leading with such problem. And another example, if it is a legal case, then maybe your legal advisor should be the one heading the team. Okay, but uh, and of course in corporate comm, a professional needs to be part of every team, yeah, because we are the backbone to the communication, yeah, in times of crisis. They may have the information that they want to put out, but we would be the one or the best person to structure it properly and to put it in an understandable manner before delivering it to people. But managers must also understand they should avoid putting senior level executives in charge of communication for all crises, okay, because sometimes the person closest to the crisis is the one people would want to hear from. Okay, if you were to put the face of your CEO in all communication, okay, uh, well, it's okay if he is well versed with everything, yeah, but sometimes people who are orang kata apa, in the operation line would know better. People would want to hear from them better than the CEO itself. But of course, later we will go to this also. In times of crisis, communication needs to be centralized, okay, which means that even though your CEO will speak on behalf of the organization, information must come out from the corporate com department, yeah, centralized, standardized, consistent, irregardless of the communication channels that you use. Okay. um, okay, now um, you need to plan to centralize your communication. And number five is to plan to centralize your communication. So although organization can employ either a centralized or decentralized approach to corporate com for general purposes, but in times of crisis the approach must be completely centralized, yeah, completely centralized. Okay. um, Decentralized organization often find it more difficult to communicate efficiently between division, yeah, especially if they have not given the interdivisional communication full consideration at the crisis planning phase, yeah. When you decentralize or use a decentralized communication in times of crisis, you may face a situation where different people gives out different information, okay, uh, which sometimes can be very detrimental for your organization, because when there is an inconsistency of information, especially in terms of statistics, figures, etc., it gives a bad impression for the organization, and sometimes it causes more than just the loss of credibility. Yeah, sometimes it may result to the loss of reputation itself, because people will see that you are you cannot be dependent on, yeah, in terms of getting good information, right? And then number six is to determine what to include in a formal plan. Okay, a normal crisis or formal plan will have five, yes, five different things, or five list of things that you need to include in a formal plan. Number one is a list of whom to notify in an emergency. Number two, an approach to media relations. Number three, a strategy to notify employees. Number four, a location to serve as a crisis headquarters. And number five, a description of the entire communication plan. Now we will discuss all these five elements in another video.